Well, welcome, good morning, and a belated welcome to day 2 of the Canadian Humanitarian Conference. I hope your first panels were productive and insightful. I can definitely guarantee that this next session will be productive and insightful. It is a very great honor and privilege for us to welcome to the conference and to Ottawa the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Baroness Valerie Amos. Most of you in this community will know her very, very well already, so I will not belabor an introduction because I want to make sure we maximize the time we have to hear from her. But suffice it to say that she brings to this role a very long career and a very distinguished career in both domestic governance but also international affairs. She was a distinguished British diplomat, including as the United Kingdom's High Commissioner to Australia. She has served in senior roles in the British Cabinet, including as Secretary of State for International Development and in the House of Lords. She has presided over the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at a time of great global volatility and fragility, and has organized the global responses to a number of very, very difficult and often protracted crises. So it is a great privilege for us and a great honor for us to have some time to benefit from her experience and wisdom and insight. We are grateful for her time. We know how precious it is. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming to the conference Valerie Amos.
Khalil, thank you very much indeed for that very, very warm welcome. Colleagues, good morning. And my thanks before I start to the Humanitarian Coalition, IDRC, OCA, DFAT-D and AKFC for hosting this conference. I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to join you at this second annual Canadian Humanitarian Conference. And I understand that your discussions yesterday and indeed this morning have already been extremely thought-provoking. And I'm sure that the rest of today will be equally stimulating. I'd also like to thank the Government of Canada, which plays a significant role in crisis response, as I myself saw in the Philippines last year. I very much hope that we're not going to have to repeat that this year. We're all keeping our fingers crossed for the next 24 hours. And the government, of course, is also a strong supporter of humanitarian work around the world. And a huge thank you to the NGOs and other partners who are here today, who are at the forefront of efforts to save lives around the world. I've been asked to talk to you about some of the global challenges which are facing us as a humanitarian community, and to just give some pointers as to the actions that we can take to stay relevant and effective. The world is in the midst of political turmoil, and as solutions to intractable conflicts seem further and further away, the world looks increasingly to us, the humanitarian community, for action. In a paradoxical way, more is expected of us as hopes fade for political solutions to long-term crises. We're in the spotlight, and our successes and failures are amplified as never before with the growth of social media and a 24/7 news cycle. We're often judged not by what we have been able to do, but by what others have failed to do. So these are truly challenging times when humanitarian actors are being called on to deal with the consequences of crises that have their roots in conflict, poverty, inequality, poor governance, and underdevelopment. In addition, there is the impact of climate change, environmental degradation, and population growth in some parts of the world. High levels of internal displacement and forced migration as a result of natural disasters and conflict is putting a huge strain on some already fragile and vulnerable countries. And in addition, we have rising insecurity and instability caused by the growth of terrorists and armed groups. And there's also something else, and it's quite hard to put a finger on it, but it's popular uprisings challenging democratically elected governments. And people are never quite sure which side they should sit when we see something like that. There are now very few conflicts which are national in character. They're regional and they're global. Syria and Iraq, for example, which are impacting on political relations with Gulf countries and Iran, and through refugee flows and significant security concerns on Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and having an impact on the broader dimensions of the politics of the Middle East. The crisis in Yemen, which is also having a significant and complex regional, political, and security impact on things like people trafficking and migration flows from Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and other countries in East Africa. And I could go on and make similar connections with the conflicts in Libya, Mali, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. This increasing complexity and connectivity is not only testing humanitarian response efforts, it is testing the principles that are the very foundation of our work. Attempts are being made to politicize our work as never before. In the interest of time, I'm going to make some broad generalizations about the different types of work we undertake. First, emergency response, classic humanitarian response in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster. But then response to slow onset crises. Think the consequences of drought and famine, where investment in early warning, prevention, social safety nets, and building the resilience of communities is key. And increasingly, the work that we are doing in the midst of conflict, desperately trying to get access to those who desperately need help. Humanitarian workers putting their lives on the line. Between 2002 and 2013, over 80% of the money we asked for through UN interagency humanitarian appeals was for assistance to people affected by conflict and violence. Conflicts are now protracted. Look at Darfur in Sudan. Look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia. The average length of time a person is now displaced in the world is 17 years. When I made my first visit to Syria nearly 4 years ago, I was trying to persuade the government that they had a humanitarian crisis on their hands. About 1 million people were in urgent need of help and assistance then. That figure now stands at over 12 million inside the country, and over 3 million have fled to other countries. So our work is multi-layered and multidimensional, requiring distinct approaches that address specific elements in different types of crisis, but also requiring greater attention to be paid to areas where our work connects with that of other partners, partners working in the areas of, for example, preventive diplomacy, peace building, and development. And of course, we have to re-look at the role played by national governments. Statistics don't tell the whole story, but they do give an indication of the rise in global humanitarian need. Over the past 10 years, the amount that we have requested through humanitarian appeals has risen from $3 billion to $17.9 billion for 2014. 3 times as many people, more than 100 million, now need assistance. The number of disasters associated with climate change, including storms and floods, increased by roughly 10 occurrences per year over the past decade. Last year produced the highest number of people killed by floods in a decade and a record $118.6 billion in damage. And if you look at the figures that Oxfam have produced, they project that the number of people affected by climate-related disasters will rise to 375 million by next year, a more than 50% increase on the average number over the past decade. Of course, there are a whole number of reasons for this increase. It's being fueled by higher concentrations of people living in flood, storm, and drought-prone areas, and a lack of adaptation strategies to protect them. And while experts differ on whether droughts are actually increasing, what is clear is that they are affecting the livelihoods and food security of greater numbers of people. 1/6 of the world's population lives in arid and semi-arid regions. 2.4 billion people in Southern Asia are expected to live in areas of high water stress over the next 50 years. And 250 million Africans will be doing so by 2020. And if you add all of those figures with what we are seeing in terms of armed conflict, they add up to a huge number. Armed conflict forced 33.3 million people to become internally displaced by the end of last year, and the number of refugees increased by 21%. About 78% of those displaced last year came from just 5 conflict-affected countries: Syria, the DRC, the Central African Republic, Nigeria, and Sudan. And 3 of those countries, Sudan, the DRC, and Somalia, were responsible for more than half of all humanitarian appeal requests between 2002 and 2012. Just 3 countries. So we know that something must be wrong if over a 10-year period and with billions of dollars of investments, we're still negotiating access, we're still trying to save lives and bring people the basics that they need to survive. Because behind each and every one of those numbers is a child, a woman, a man needing our help and support. These are the most vulnerable people in the world. And conflict particularly has a woman's face, a child's face. In the 4 years that I've been in this job, I've seen the best, and I have to say the worst, that we as people can do to each other. I've seen the aggressive use of state sovereignty as an excuse for inaction in countries where there is a clear humanitarian imperative. I've seen the callousness of leaders whose rhetoric is inclusiveness and concern for their people, but whose practice is something else. I've seen increasing fragility, fragmentation, polarization and marginalization, but also greater connectivity between people of different cultures and religions. I've seen individual and community resilience. I've seen fights for justice, equality, and human rights played out locally and played out globally. And I've seen people and donors around the world support resource mobilization at unprecedented levels. 2013 was a record year for humanitarian giving, with $22 billion mobilized in response, 1/4 of it from private givers, most of them individuals. And there is the know-how, the innovation we have tapped into from the private sector, like DHL and Ericsson at the global level, but also the myriad of small and medium-sized enterprises in many countries that are right there supporting community response efforts. So we have to think about how, against this backdrop, we can adapt to ensure that the humanitarian sector is providing the right solutions for people who need it and making sure that those people continue to be treated with respect and dignity. We have to reform to stay relevant. We talk a lot about innovation in our business. But that innovation is not just about technology, it's also about how we do our work. To be effective, we must listen to people and work with them to find sustainable solutions. Not so much of the "you do what we say is good for you." Humanitarian organisations are looking at different ways in which we can engage with people individually and collectively, using, for example, Track FM to conduct countrywide, citizen-centred, interactive radio polls. Fostering partnerships, a critical part of being successful, because no community, no government or agency can address the scale of these crises alone. And that's why the preparations that we are putting in place for the World Humanitarian Summit, which will take place in Istanbul in May 2016, is so important. Because with the growth in humanitarian need, the pressure on resources, increasing numbers of actors, including private sector partners, and challenges to the principles which underpin our work, the consultative fora in the run-up to the summit are an opportunity to debate the challenges we face and to develop a forward-looking agenda. We need to work together to create a truly global, diverse, and inclusive humanitarian system. We need to foster greater cooperation, not competition, as is happening today, for example, in Sierra Leone, in the fight against Ebola. Cuban doctors from the Cuban Ministry of Health, trained by the World Health Organization, working in field hospitals run by NGOs such as Save the Children, hospitals built by the UK military and paid for from the UK humanitarian aid budget. One example of effective partnership. The growth in cash transfers has been made possible because of the cooperation of banks working with aid organisations. Partnerships with telecommunications companies, which have helped us to find people trapped in rubble after disasters, helped us to communicate with more people and save time and resources because we can find out exactly what people need. We need to encourage these partnerships, these different ways of working between humanitarian actors, the private sector, and affected communities. A strong message emerging from the World Humanitarian Summit regional consultations is to need to forge more equal and inclusive partnerships with national NGO and civil society organisations. National NGOs, which are at the forefront of humanitarian response, and far more in tune with community capacities and needs, but may not have a seat at the table when response decisions are being made. This needs to change. Let me now turn to one of the most complex areas of our work: how to protect the humanitarian principles, the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality as we work in increasingly politicized environments. Turning these tools, these principles, into practical tools are the best means, I think, we have to stay and deliver assistance and to protect their integrity. On the ground, building the acceptance of local communities. That is how NGOs are still able to operate, for example, in ISIL-controlled areas in Syria, where we as the United Nations are not able to go. In negotiating access, we must be firm about our limits, establish our collective red lines. This year in Chad, my own organisation, OCHA, negotiated safe access to crisis areas so that permanent humanitarian field operations could be established in remote locations where refugees and Chadian returnees were arriving in large numbers, fleeing the fighting in South Sudan and the Central African Republic. The last 2 years have been a huge challenge in this regard. I cannot tell you how much time I have personally spent, and I know many of you have as well, trying to push back the attempts to politicize our work. We all know that we need to understand the political context in which we're working, but keeping humanitarian response separate to political influence in, for example, Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and Gaza has been particularly difficult. And we face an additional challenge: the continuing undermining of international humanitarian and human rights laws. I don't have the answer to this. Flagrant violations go unpunished. I brief the Security Council on a regular basis on crisis situations around the world. They make strong statements about violations of international humanitarian law, but nothing happens, nothing changes, raising questions, I think, about the accountability of governments that have signed up to these principles but don't practice them. We need to find a way to address this. After every major conflict, we say, never again. And yet what I see every day is an inability to halt the violence, a turning to humanitarian workers to do the protection by presence, which we should not have to do. We need to find political solutions. But I think we also need a greater sense of active global citizenship to deliver the more peaceful, the more just world that we would all like to see. And I think it's something that we can work on together. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, good morning. To have the incredible privilege to be just after you. First of all, I would like, I guess, on my behalf and the rest of the room, to thank you for your thorough intervention, which is echoing with several of the discussion we had this morning and yesterday, obviously. Especially the one with the private sector, building resilience of local population, the negotiation of humanitarian access, the coordination and not the competition, and so on. Others should probably come in future conference. Unfortunately, we cannot speak of everything in 2 days, unfortunately. Alors, ça nous donne de l'espoir pour...
So this gives us hope for other conferences and other discussions in the future.
To our second Canadian conference, which it's, I would say, a testimony of the contribution of the humanitarian community in Canada in the global response. Je pense que nous avons...
I believe we still have a lot to do to contribute to the various problems and issues you mentioned, but hearing you, I get the hope that solutions may be found.
Practical, but not operational. Comme vous le savez,
As you know, a conference of this type is a unique opportunity to construct our humanitarian community, which is relatively young compared to our friends in Europe and the United States. Here in this room, you are the practitioners, the researchers, the professionals, the analysts, the future politicians, perhaps, for humanitarian purposes. The idea behind this conference was to mobilize to build this humanitarian community in Canada. Madam Amos said how important coordination among practitioner communities was essential, the private sector and the public. Now I am an academic, and I would add research and knowledge. We've done a lot. I'm looking at my colleagues from the Humanitarian Coalition. We've done much so that this coalition be well integrated at this conference. That we still have a lot to do, I'm convinced, if we want this relationship to find solutions to the various dilemmas and problems you mentioned during your talk. Your presence among us, however, does show interest among the various practitioners community. We have to stop working in silos. We have to look at ourselves as multidimensional and multidisciplinary. And working in silos does not help us find solutions. But we have made efforts. And in that spirit, Nicolas mentioned it yesterday, I'm delighted that I can work as a publisher for an international document to publish the best manuscripts, the best papers that were submitted at this conference.
Of development studies will be published hopefully in 2015 and will include the best papers submitted to this conference. I would like to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their support for that particular matter. We also wish to pursue the conversation, the interaction between now and the next conference to come. There's no planned officially conference next year. We will discuss it eventually with the partners, but if it's not next year, it will be soon. And the idea is not to stop our conversation or communication today, but rather to continue to pursue collaboration between the different community of practice. So I invite you to stay connected to our different websites, obviously, for the special edition to come, but as well as many other publication, blogs, interview, lessons learned, and paper that will be published through this conference. And I encourage you as well to submit and to participate to this creation of know-how in order to be part of the multiple challenges that were discussed during those 2 days. Alors, vous serez certainement sollicité dans la prochaine année pour la suite.
So in the upcoming year, you will be asked to participate to various types of research. That's one of the challenges. It's also a challenge for researchers to trust organizations and to work with them to find solutions to the issues that are extremely complex, as you know. Madame Amos, once again, thank you for being among us. I salute you. I take into account every word you said, and on my behalf and on behalf of the whole room here, we thank you for all of your contribution in your position, which I understand you will be leaving soon. And I thank you for your efforts towards coordination and for having spoken so clearly at the Security Council, which is limited in its political action, as we all know. Thank you once again.